Shall I start? Oh, good. Oh, hello. Thank you all for coming to the third plenary of the 2021 ASEN Conference on Nationalism and Crisis. I am delighted to welcome you to my living room, which I never thought could accommodate an entire plenary session of the ASEN, of an ASEN conference. I am one of the founders of ASEN back in 1990, and I chaired ASEN for several years and watched it grow and thrive and multiply. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Professor Bart Bonikowski, who will be addressing us on foregrounding nationalism in theories of radical right success. Professor Bonikowski is Associate Professor of Sociology at New York University. His work takes insights from cultural sociology and applies them to the study of political processes, and especially to processes which interest ASEN, such as national identifications, and how national identifications operate at the societal level. And also, he studies top-down national mobilization by political elites. Professor Bonikowski's work is impressively scholarly and innovative. He's not just using new data, but he's using new forms of data, such as survey experiments, large bodies of political speeches, and social media content. His work has appeared in the best journals, such as European Union Politics, the American Journal of Sociology, and of course, Nations and Nationalism. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Wall Street Journal, Pakistan Today, and the South China Morning Post. His forthcoming book is entitled Radicalized: How the Right has Mobilized Nationalism and Undermined Liberal Democracy. It will be published by Princeton University Press, and we look forward to reading it and reviewing it in Nations and Nationalism. I am delighted to present Professor Bonikowski to us. And after his paper, we welcome questions, which you can put in the chat on Facebook, YouTube, or Zoom, and they will be passed to me to ask of Professor Bonikowski. So, Professor Bonikowski, on to you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Athena. It's wonderful to be here. As a longtime fan of ASEN, I'm just delighted that I could speak with you. I wish you were in person, but so be it. Next time. So let me put up my slides, and then we can get started. So the talk today is it's a hybrid part about theory and kind of how to think about the radical right theoretically, how to think about it, explaining the rise of the radical right, or perhaps more appropriately explaining its mainstreaming. And also there'll be an empirical component where I will show you some findings from a forthcoming paper that speaks to one element in that theoretical model that I'll present. So, to start off, I'll put on some characters on the screen with whom you're very familiar. And as I often do this at the beginning, and this cast of characters just keeps growing, right? So these are radical right leaders from across Europe and the United States, and one can go beyond, but the scope of what I'll talk about today is primarily about Europe, the United States, and other Anglo democracies. And the fact that this cast of characters have been growing over the past the past few decades, 2-3 decades, presents at least three major puzzles as I see it. The first puzzle is, what is the radical right? What is this thing that these characters represent and the parties that they lead represent, and what kind of what kind of base of support do they have? Why has this form of politics been surging over the last while? And really, the surge, if you will, can be dated to about, mid-90s onward, although a lot of these parties have much longer histories than that. And what are the consequences of the rise of this form of politics? And today I'll focus primarily on the first two questions with a brief nod to the third. I think to to understand what these parties are all about and why they've been surging, we really need models, theoretical models that are precise, that use precise concepts, they use precise measures, if they're quantitative or precise operationalizations, whether they're qualitative, and whether the data is qualitative, and also they need to be comparative, right? As just the pictures that I put on the screen illustrate, this form of politics has been growing all around the world. And at the very least in Europe and the Anglo democracies. And so to understand what's happening, we need to think about case similarities and as well as particularities. So again, analytical clarity and measurability, I think is crucial. I think we need to think about both the supply and demand sides of politics. That is, what are politicians offering and what it is that citizens are asking for. And how these two sides of politics come together. That is, under what circumstances is radical right politics mobilized successfully? To do so, I think we also need to pay attention not just to what's on offer politically and what the people want, but also the contextual structural changes that are making pre-existing claims and pre-existing attitudes resonate anew. And I think that's sort of a central argument that I'll try to put forth today. We also need, in my view, multi-causal explanations, right? The election of Barack Obama was really important to the election of Donald Trump, right? It was an important precondition. Obviously, that's an idiosyncratic development in the United States alone. So that, the election of Obama may help in explaining the US, but it won't help explain Orban, obviously. And so we need explanations that pay attention to these differences across cases, but perhaps identify common mechanisms that work across these cases with all of your other idiosyncrasies. So again, specificity and overarching trends and mechanisms. And finally, as I want to highlight today, and as I've highlighted in the title of the topic, I think we need to place nationalism at the foreground of our explanations, and we need to theorize and measure, operationalize nationalism adequately. And I don't think that's been done for most part in the existing literature on the topic, although there are plenty of wonderful examples of people having done this in the last few years, including many of the people involved in ASEN, obviously. But in a lot of the classic explanations of radical right rise, nationalism was simply described as nativism, not thoroughly theorized. There wasn't much attention to the long literature on nationalism that ASEN represents. And again, the operationalization often was reduced to something like anti-immigrant sentiment, which in my view is a correlate of nationalism, but is not coterminous with nationalism. So the key insights of the model I want to propose to you today is, first of all, that radical right consists of three elements: populism, certain varieties of nationalism, and authoritarianism. This is not something I invented. Kasmuda argued this a long time ago, but I concur. That nationalist cleavages, that is, differences in how people understand the nation, when they are made salient, when these cleavages are made salient, are the most potent mobilizing feature of this form of politics. That aggregate trends in how nationalist a given population is are actually not the most important thing. Because for most part, there's stability there, or if anything, greater inclusion in most places. What instead matters are all kinds of things that are bubbling up underneath, both on the supply and demand side of politics. That is, different kind of combinations of discursive frames that the radical right politicians use, kind of the bringing of populist nationalism and authoritarianism in different ways together, the polarization of nationalist beliefs across parties and across subsets of the population, the erosion of old identities, and so forth. And if we pay attention to these features of a potential theoretical model, we can understand why the radical right has been surging, and then we can think about what its nefarious consequences might be. And I want to argue that these three components, populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism, each have different consequences. So the radical right is dangerous for liberalism, the liberal part of liberal democracy, because of nationalism, particular varieties of it. It is dangerous for democratic institutions because of authoritarianism and the way it runs roughshod over democratic norms and principles. And populism itself has dangerous implications for the civil sphere and how people think about truth claims and about epistemic authority and so forth. Then the specific empirical trend I'm gonna zoom in on toward the second half of the talk will be this thing I mentioned just a minute ago, the sorting of nationalism by political camps. And I'm going to talk about the US in particular. A lot of the evidence I'll talk about today is US specific, but the model is intended to be much more, to travel much more widely than that. So the idea is that these different ways of thinking about the nation have long been latent in US political culture and been rather stable in the aggregate, but in recent years, they become more politically mobilizable and more manifest. That is, people vote and participate in politics increasingly based on their nationalist beliefs. And this is particularly true in the 2016 election. And part of the reason for that is that what it means to be American, people's conceptions of what it means to be American have themselves sorted across the two major parties in the United States. And this has happened just as fears by the white majority of status threat, of potential drop in their status in a racial hierarchy have become exacerbated in recent years. Again, empirical evidence from the US, but the model is broader than that. So I'm going to start by telling you what I think of nationalism, when I say nationalism, what do I mean by it, how it relates to other components of the radical right, give you an overview of the model that could help us understand why the radical right has been mainstream in recent years, give you some hypotheses for the empirical part, and then present some results, and then zoom out to implications for democracy and for our research. So let me come back to those three puzzles, right? What is the radical right? Why has it been surging? And what the consequences might be? So the radical right is many things to many people. There have been tons of different concepts thrown out there. Often they're used coterminously with the radical right. And in fact, the radical right is not the only way to frame this phenomenon. Other people call it reactionary right-wing politics and so forth. And all of these concepts have their own flaws. But I want to argue with Kasmuda and others that the radical right really has three components, both in terms of the kind of claims that radical right politicians make and the kinds of demand side beliefs and attitudes that voters hold. The first component is populism. And you probably know roughly what I mean by that. It's a way of making moral political claims that juxtapose some sort of a vilified elite with the virtuous people. And this dichotomy is Manichaean. The idea is that there's an irreconcilable conflict of interest between the elites and the people. The elites are only out for their own interests and the interests of the groups with whom they're allied. And those groups vary. And the people are the ones who should have rightful access to power. And of course, the elites can be politicians, they can be, economic elites, they can be intellectuals. They're quite fungible and vary across the ideologies with which populism is associated. The third component is authoritarianism, and that is essentially a way of governing that undermines democratic norms, liberal democratic norms and institutions. And essentially, it's a way for radical right politicians to stay in power and do so with a justification that they are representing the interests of the people against the elites, but also against various groups that are seen as outside of the boundaries of the nation. And this is where nationalism comes in, the third component of radical right politics. And when I say nationalism, I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second. But there are dozens of definitions of what nationalism means. I mean specifically conceptions that people hold in their minds that draw on common culture and they're represented in popular narratives, including political language, of what the nation actually means, right? And what the nation means is composed of multiple components. There is the component that we often know in the literature as civic versus ethnic nationalism, right? That is boundaries of the nation, who's in, who's out, legitimately. So for some, kind of more ethnic nationalism, inclusion in the country is really about ancestry, about birth in the country, about race, ethnicity, religion, immutable characteristics. For others, as you all very well know, it's about more elective characteristics, just feeling subjectively affiliated with a nation, respecting its laws and institutions. And that is one component of nationalism that's been studied in its own respect, which is totally reasonable. I've done so as well. But my argument is that it's not the sole thing that constitutes our conceptions of nationhood. It's an important aspect of it, that is these symbolic boundaries of who's a legitimate member, who's not. But there are also other aspects. There are questions about how proud people are of the nation and the state. What features of the nation and the state are they most proud of? And is the state, for instance, something to be celebrated as essentially this congruent unit, as Gellner would put it, of politics and culture? Or is the state something to be feared of and skeptical of, as a lot of anti-statist American right-wing voters believe? So these aspects of national institutions and heritage that people are more or less proud of. That's the second component. Again, this has been studied in its own respect, which is perfectly reasonable, but in the way I think about it, it's a component of cognitive representation of nationhood. Finally, there is this question of where the nation stands vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And this is typically described as chauvinism, as hubris in some of my work, but also in political psychology as nationalism per se, right? Which is just adds to more confusion. But this is essentially a question of, is the nation, for example, in the US case, is the US military a force of humanitarian good or policeman of the world? Is the country the best country in the world? Do we think of ourselves as superior to all other nations or not? So this element is also an important component of how we think about who we are as a national community. And the argument, there's a twofold argument here. First of all, these ideas that are represented with these photos are arranged in relational structures, relational networks. You can think of them as cognitive representations, you can think of them as cognitive schemas, you can think of them as cultural models. So what each component means depends in part on what other components connect it to, right? If you tell me you think of English as a crucial prerequisite for being American, I can't tell just from that response whether you're an ethno-nationalist or a civic Republican. But if I find out how you think about other aspects of nationhood, I can then triangulate your answers and get a sense of what English language capacity means to you. So that one insight is these ideas are relationally composed into these networks of representations. The second is that they're heterogeneous within countries. That is, not everyone agrees about what America means or what the Netherlands means or what France means, right? There's heterogeneity within countries in these ideas. And here you've got two representations on the screen of sort of these kind of toy examples of two different frameworks of what America means. For one person, it's sort of elective criteria of membership, pride in the state, kind of a humanitarian projection of power abroad, and so forth. For the person on the right or the group on the right, we can zoom these out to more aggregate components of national populations. Religion is an important aspect. Christianity is an important aspect of American nationhood, as is language, as is birth in the country. The state is something to be feared and resisted, and at the same time, maybe paradoxically, the state should project its power abroad in a military manner. So again, toy examples, but different conceptions of American nationhood. And I want to posit to you that these competing conceptions are essentially representative of deep nationalist cleavages in national populations. There's a lot of within country heterogeneity, as I mentioned, in how people understand their own nation. And this is a tradition that goes long back to historical research by Roger Smith and many others. It's not something I invented. I merely try to measure it with surveys. And in past work, including research with Paul DiMaggio, but many other articles, I've shown that these nationalist beliefs coherent to four robust schemas observed across countries, across time. It basically doesn't matter what data I use, which variables I use, which time period I use. The same four types emerge. Now, some of you may have read an article in the journal that we all love in recent times that has sort of challenged whether indeed this model is robust, whether there are four types. Well, I won't talk about it now, but rest assured a response is coming to that very useful and interesting critique. And bottom line is, as far as I'm concerned, as far as my co-authors are concerned, this model stands. That is, you could argue that maybe there are 5 types of nationalism, maybe there's 6, maybe there are 29. That becomes a decision that is partly methodological, but also theoretical. Based on our own research, these 4 types seem to do a pretty good job of summarizing the tremendous complexity in the survey data. We call them liberal, restrictive, ardent, and disengaged. I'll talk about them in a little bit. They are patterned, they are stable, they have tremendous external validity. That is, they're correlated with a whole range of sociodemographic variables and correlated with a whole slew of social and political attitudes. They're also rooted in everyday experience. So essentially, we can think of them as latent cleavages that can be activated at certain times. So they're latent for most part, right? People's other identities are superordinate and more important. Maybe your identity as a spouse, your professional identity, your identity as having a particular hobby. Maybe those are more important, or your ethnic identity. But at times, national identities, these conceptions of nationhood, can become more important. They can be activated and mobilized for political ends. And I want to argue that the recent past is one of those historical junctures. In the past, these ideas about the nation cut across ideology, party, and race. But the question is that still true in the United States and perhaps elsewhere? And are these definitions of nationhood associated with political behavior, something that we hadn't studied before? We only looked at their association with attitudes. Today, in this latter part of the talk, I'll talk about how they're associated with voting preferences in the US in 2016, and how that was in part preceded by their changing distribution across the 2 parties. So that's what I think of as the radical right, its components and the importance of nationalism for understanding it. Let me tell you let me describe to you the broader theoretical model that animates the book that I'm working on, and sort of really kind of fits in most of the work that I've done on the topic. So the question really is, why has the radical right been mainstreamed in recent years? Why has it been surging? So I want to, in a nutshell, claim that these nationalist cleavages that I've described to you are the fuel that stokes the fire. So really, that starts the fire. Anti-elitism and low institutional trust that are part and parcel of populism are what adds further fuel, that stokes the fire further, right? So you've got these nationalist cleavages as the initial spark. The anti-elitism and low institutional trust stoke the fire. And then tolerance for authoritarian rule is the consequence of this. So that's nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism, right? Deep cleavages around different understandings of the nation are the key driver. Populism exacerbates that problem, and authoritarian rule becomes more acceptable as a result. But all three, populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism, actually have been quite stable, both on the supply and demand side, in terms of what claims have been available to politicians and what beliefs have existed in the populations. What's changed is less their distribution and more their relative salience over time. So why would this be the case, right? How can we think of change explained by constants? How could it be that pre-existing frames that have been out there and pre-existing beliefs that have been out there all of a sudden resonate in new ways? And this is where I want to talk about sort of culturally mediated structural changes. The context within which these claims and attitudes relate to one another, the context has changed itself. And interestingly and complicatedly, some of those changes have been real and some of them have been solely perceived. But regardless, whether they're real or perceived, they've been a source of anxiety that's been exploited by radical right politicians in powerful ways. So which changes matter? Again, real and perceived. Obviously, economic changes matter, whether it's economic crises or deindustrialization and labor mobility and capital mobility. So there's a whole literature on this in economics by Italo Colantone, Danny Roderick, many others. And this has been one side of the explanation, right? It's about the economics. Others say it's not about economics, it's about other things. So it's also about demographic change. It's about growth in migration and refugee flows. It's about terrorism and fears around national security. It's about changes in the relative perceived status of groups that come partly through the redress of past injustices, but are perceived as giving some groups an unfair leg up. So affirmative action in the United States is a flashpoint issue around this. It's about changes in popular culture, right? This sounds a little bit like Norris and Engelhardt, but the idea that which groups are valorized in popular culture has shifted over time. This is not to say that, for example, Hollywood is all of a sudden egalitarian and everybody gets a fair shake at it. No, it's still dominated by white people, certainly in terms of the business, but also even the presence on the stage. But it's changed in relative emphasis across different groups over time. It's become more egalitarian in its norms. It's also about social movements and demands for greater justice. And finally, in some cases, it's about particular idiosyncratic shifts like the election of President Obama and the birther movement that really united nationalism, authoritarianism, and populism in one package. The point here is that all of these changes, the mix of these shifts, of these changes, differs from country to country, but they all have the same relative consequence, and that is a consequence I'll describe in a second. Basically, what's going on is you've got the supply and demand side of politics. This is what's going on in my view. This is not the truth, it's my argument. The supply side and demand side of politics. On both sides, you've got nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism in claims and in attitudes. Over time, there's stability in these claims and these attitudes on the surface, but underneath things are happening. So for example, you've got the recombination of these frames by politicians over time. Parties that were neoliberal in the late 70s, early 80s, take on a nativist, ethno-nationalist character, see if that works. When that works, they add in some populism. If that works, they'll maybe throw in some authoritarian claims. Eventually coming at a winning formula, slightly different than Kitschel's, but related, which then can diffuse across countries. A way of bringing together populism, nationalism, authoritarianism together in a way that resonates. They also fuse these ideas. So I have a paper forthcoming, experimental paper that shows if you expose right-wing voters in the United States, respondents in the United States, with populism alone, just anti-elite claims, it results in greater antipathy towards minorities. That is, populism has become a dog whistle, a stand-in for exclusion and nationalism. That is, these frames have been fused. You also have inversion, which a number of us have written about. Dr. Haliokopoulou has written about it. I've written about it with Christina Simonsen as well and others. The idea that civic nationalism, the good stuff, can be turned on its head and used for exclusion against Muslims in Western Europe, for example. So these are creative, strategic uses of nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism by political elites. On the demand side, what appears to be maybe stability in the aggregate in many countries has a lot of stuff happening underneath. So one thing that happens is these beliefs about nationhood, or about, for that matter, populism and elites, can sort across political camp and socio-demographic camps. And that's something I'll talk about empirically in a minute. Older identities have also eroded, as we know, whether it's labor identities, social democratic partisan affiliations. over the course of the last 40 years, these other identities that used to give people a sense of worth, particularly working people, often white people, white working class people, these sorts of identities have eroded rapidly, leaving behind an identity vacuum that nationalist identities, nationalist beliefs can fill in. So that's kind of what's been happening on the supply and demand side of my argument. But in the meantime, we've got these structural changes that I just described to you around the economy, demography, and so forth, demographic change, terrorism, etc. These changes create fears and anxieties of all sorts that are largely inchoate. And some of these changes are real, some are not. The refugee crisis in Europe is real. Rising immigration from Mexico and the US is not real. Immigration from Mexico has been declining for many years, but it's perceived as a problem. These fears are inchoate, but what politicians, strategic politicians, opportunistic politicians do is they bundle them into a sense of overall crisis and channel them into resentments towards specific outgroups. So they turn these fears and anxieties into bundled resentments that then create a sense of perceived collective status threat among white majorities. It doesn't have to be white majorities if we go beyond Europe and the United States. In India, it's the Hindu majority, right? You can go to other countries where the composition is quite different. So really the majority that's the dominant status majority is the one that typically is threatened. In the case of European countries in the US, it's typically the white majority. When that perceived collective status threat is mobilized, or activated, you've got the mobilization of these pre-existing frames and attitudes under new conditions. That's the overall argument. And when that happens, then you've got the rise of radical right parties and their increasing mainstreaming and success. And importantly, this whole thing diffuses across countries, because one of the things that these parties do once in power is they put in, they institute a whole bunch of authoritarian changes, reforms, as happened in Turkey, as happened in Hungary, and they borrow that from one another, much as they borrow the framing strategies, much as they borrow the way of representing threats and fears and activating collective status threat. So even if these leaders disagree, as Kaczynski and Orban do, for instance, they will borrow from one another the bundles of frames and the authoritarian strategies that follow, and the entire model diffuses, right? So it's not just about domestic politics, it's about mimicry and isomorphism across countries. Today, in the remaining, not very much, I guess the next 50 minutes or so, I'll tell you about one piece of this puzzle. So I've got work on various pathways here in this model, and I'll obviously draw on the work of many other scholars. But the specific piece I'll tell you about is really about the link between these nationalist cleavages, their partisan sorting, and their mobilization in politics, in this particular case in the United States in 2016. In describing this pathway, I'll briefly also mention some of the structural shocks in the nationalist discourse that was evoking these beliefs. So this is just one piece of the bigger puzzle. So let me tell you about that puzzle. So it's really about trying to figure out whether nationalism was successful, was important in 2016, which kinds of nationalism were important in 2016, and what happened before. To answer these questions, what happened before in terms of the distribution of these beliefs. To answer these questions, I use multiple ways of survey data, some of them publicly available, some of them collected by myself and my collaborators, generate some hypotheses about the way in which candidates in the US in 2016 framed their political claims. And we do some text analysis to verify our insights and intuitions about this. And then we look at which types of nationalism were associated with support for which candidate, based on data that I collected the weekend before the election. So pretty reliable time period, because it was a couple of days right before people were going to go vote. And I collected these data with Yuval Feinstein from Haifa. So prospective voting, but also we collected data on their primary election choices, retrospective data from a few months earlier. So collected the weekend before the election, but retrospective of behavior a few months earlier. We then, after we relate these nationalist beliefs to voting preferences, we examine long-term trends in the distribution of these nationalist beliefs in the aggregate and by party. And I'll report the results to you. The data come from a variety of surveys, as I mentioned. I won't get into the details, but they feature 23 items that span the familiar to you by now batteries of nationalism questions, relatively uncontroversial as far as I'm concerned. So degree of attachment to the nation, kind of the strength of national identity, criteria of national membership. That's the part about who's in, who's out, as far as legitimate membership goes. Sometimes this is described as civic versus ethnic nationalism, but we also know that it's more complicated than that, since ethnic is also often ethnocultural. Sometimes people hold civic and ethnic criteria at the same time, as Robert Kunovich has shown us. But you get the sense of what this is. Then we have national pride, which sometimes is called patriotism by political psychologists, and I think slightly problematic ways, but that's the category. So domain-specific pride, pride in which aspects of the nation and the state are you most proud of. And finally, chauvinism, comparison of the nations vis-a-vis the rest of the world, as I showed you in those pictures. And again, this is complicated because political psychologists think this is nationalism and nothing else is nationalism. So again, terminology varies, but I call it chauvinism or hubris. We use latent class analysis, a method for reducing the complexity of these of the data to more manageable categories, and I'll describe that to you in a second. So basically, the way latent class analysis works is that it takes this is a toy example. It takes a number of variables. These are the columns and the number of respondents' observations in the rows, and it looks for patterns of similar responses across those variables. So latent class analysis in this toy example would see, oh look, respondents A, C, and F have a similar profile of responses. Then respondent B, D, and E have another similar profile of responses, and respondent G is an isolate. And the idea here is the assumption is if people respond to the same questions in a similar way, that may suggest that they think similarly about this particular domain of social life. That is, maybe they hold similar views, similar cognitive representations of that domain. That's the insight. So it comes back to those relational models I showed you. And what latent class analysis will then do is essentially cluster people into these groups of similarly responding respondents. There are all kinds of ways we can talk about model fit. One just little tiny plug because I can't resist. Absolute model fit is not the best strategy for picking your model when it comes to thousands of respondents, dozens of variables, and a lot of complexity in the data. But there are ways of using relative model fit that are quite profitable for reducing what is essentially tremendous complexity. Like let's say you've got 2,000 respondents. You could plausibly argue that those 2,000 respondents represent 2,000 varieties of nationalism. Not very interesting, but plausible. You could also argue that there's only one kind of nationalism, not plausible, not supported by any theoretical work that I know of, but you could make that argument. Or you could sort of end up somewhere in between at a number of categories that is good enough in terms of fit, but also theoretically, reasonable, has feasibility, has external validity by association with other variables, and you can sort of see, well, do I get much more insight if I add more classes, more groups? If you don't, you stick with fewer. So here's where we end up. We start with 5,000 observations. That's a lot of people. 23 variables. That's a lot of variables, and we reduce this to 4 types of nationalism. The same 4 that keeps popping up no matter what data we seem to use, regardless of which country, what kind of survey. And those 4 latent classes, as I've alluded to before, we call creedal, restrictive, ardent, and disengaged. There's a lot of complexity here. This is kind of what the composition looks like. I won't get into this, but I'm just going to summarize them. Creedal nationalists are kind of your standard liberal nationalists, right? Moderate attachment to the nation, pretty open-minded criteria of national belonging, civic nationalists for the most part. High levels of pride and moderate chauvinism. This is like mainstream American nationalism, right? Proud of the country, but proud of the country as a nation of immigrants. I think America is pretty great, although not necessarily the best country in the world. Restrictive nationalists are interesting. They have high levels of attachment, but pretty exclusionary boundaries of nationhood, an ethnic conception of nationhood, but low levels of pride, especially in the state, and moderate chauvinism. So these are exclusionary nationalists who are not particularly proud of the nation as it currently operates, and a state in particular. Then we've got ardent nationalists who are kind of high across the board, right? High attachment, high pride, high chauvinism, and ethno-religious conceptions of nationhood. Again, exclusionary conceptions of nationhood. These are like your other stereotypical jingoistic, rah-rah American nationalists, right? And I'm using the US just as a shorthand, but you can imagine this in other countries too. Finally, we've got the disengaged who are kind of low across the board, moderate attachment, open-minded about national boundaries. Anyone who wants to be a member can be a member, but also low levels of pride and low levels of chauvinism. What I want to point out here is that that this is not a monotonic progression from least to most nationalists. It's actually a combination of cross-cutting ideas, right? So there are some things that creedal nationalists share with the disengaged, like civic nationalism. There are other things that they share with ardent nationalists, like high pride. And similarly, creedals and restrictives have some things in common. So these are actually cross-cutting combinations whereby each of these components of nationalist schemas means something else depending on what it's associated with. So not just a continuum. These are qualitative, discrete differences. Okay, so do these beliefs predict voting in 2016, and what happened to them prior to 2016? Well, we know what 2016 was like. Americans are just getting over their PTSD from what 2016 and 2020 was like, and everything in between, and so is the rest of the world. In 2016, Donald Trump presented an exclusionary conception of nationhood, or American nationhood, right? About the wall, keeping out immigrants, refugees, terrorists, and so forth. He also painted a picture of American carnage, as his inaugural speech has been called. America's in the dumps. We need to get our country back. And the way to get it back is to kick out the corrupt elites and restore your proper status, you white supporters, right? Hillary Clinton differed sharply. For her, it was America's nation of immigrants, and a diverse nation. That's what it was. Americanness is all about civic duty, about celebrating the state as a tool of the people to live better, right? To make everyone's lives better. So very different conceptions of American boundaries, very different conceptions of American pride, and of course, very different conceptions of American chauvinism, right? America first for Trump was very much a chauvinistic, us alone kind of conception. Okay, so those are intuitions, but we also did some text analysis of actual speeches from these candidates to see how they thought about the nation. And so I'm just going to give you some very brief results here. We looked at how do they think about the term dangerous? That is, what do they think is a danger to the nation? That often is a good proxy for boundaries. Well, for Trump, dangerous is terror, refugees, cartels, gangs, criminals, visas, right? Gays, aliens, pouring over borders. All of this is lumped together. All these categories are lumped together as something to be terrified of. Criminality, migration, homosexuality, and sort of the nation out of control, right? Turmoil lights up as well. For Trump, politics, so this is more about populism, about pride. Politics is about failure, arrogance, entrenchment, squandering, cynicism, the establishment, bitterness, and so forth. So this is an assessment of the elites, populism, but it's also an assessment of the state of the nation and its current establishment. Look at Clinton. For her, what's dangerous is bullying, violence, divisiveness, harassment, partisanship, extremism, discrimination. And then there you see Mexican and Russia, but Russia, you can imagine why. Mexicans largely, we looked into it as a critique of Trump's representation of Mexico. Very different conception of national boundaries. For Clinton, politics is about unifying, participating, prosperity, growth, contribution, believing, respect, and so forth, right? And then the negative terms here, dictatorship, fear-mongering, cynicism, are charges at Trump. Very different. We also looked at Sanders, because we also look at primary elections here, which is really, I think, actually an important aspect of the paper. For Sanders, dangerous is, if anything, it's about ignoring examples like Sweden, ignoring examples like Japan. It's about all kinds of foreign policy issues, but it's not about immigration or anything related to that. Politics, though, for Trump is similar. For Sanders is similar to Trump. The politics is also about the establishment, about the mainstream, about billionaires, about struggling people, right? About the rich. So it's here again we see populism that's economic populism, distinct from Trump's, but a similar tone, and an evaluation of the nation as in trouble because people's interests have been forsaken by the leaders. We can go on. The bottom line is moderate Republicans look more similar to Clinton than they look to Trump. So this leads to some hypotheses, and I'll wrap up in a minute. So given the way that we looked at the kind of patterns we identify in the candidate speeches, and what I told you about the nationalist beliefs, we should expect that some of the more exclusionary types of nationalism should be associated with support for Trump over Clinton in the general election. So restrictive and ardent nationalism should be more likely just to be associated with Trump support, and maybe even after controlling for the single biggest predictor of voting, which is partisan identification. That's a pretty high bar, right? Partisanship usually trumps, so to speak, everything. But we want to see whether nationalism has any kind of net effect, even controlling for partisanship. On the flip side, creedal and disengaged nationalism, the inclusive types, should be more likely to be associated with Clinton over Trump. Trump versus moderates should be kind of similar to, this is in the primary, Republican primary, should be kind of similar to Trump versus Clinton in the general, because we know that the moderate candidates did political talk quite similarly to Clinton, with the exception of one person to whom I'll get in a second. And that exception is Ted Cruz. So Cruz was very Trump-like and became more Trump-like over the course of the election. So we should see very few differences between Trump and Cruz supporters in terms of their nationalism. Finally, in the Democratic primary, we saw that Clinton and Sanders were both inclusive, but they had very different conceptions of politics, different conceptions of the nation's current state. Because of his populism, Sanders thought America's in trouble and had pretty low levels of pride in where America is now, whereas Clinton had this kind of typical creedal, highly proud discourse about America. So that one type of nationalism that we often identify, that is the disengaged class, those who have an arm's length relationship to the nation, we would expect to go for Sanders over Clinton, given his arguments about America being in deep trouble and being a nation of corrupt economic elites. Finally, two hypotheses about the long-term trends. That is, one possibility is that Trump rode a nativist wave, that right before 2016, nationalism, just exclusionary nationalism went up, and he just took advantage of that. Another one is actually that there's more aggregate stability than that, but what's happening is nationalism is sorting by party, and that's the hypothesis that we favor, and you'll see the evidence for. Okay, so very quickly, results in about 3 minutes, and then I'll wrap up. So this is Trump versus Clinton in the general election. You've got a comparison of the different types of nationalism among the respondents in the rows here. And there are three models. The top model is just nationalism alone as a predictor of voting preferences. Then we add demographic controls, and then we add party ID at the bottom. And what you see is consistently, even after adding party ID, that creedal nationalism is associated with support for Clinton over Trump, whereas ardent and restrictive nationalism is associated with support for Trump over Clinton. But also, that disengagement from the nation, that is inclusive conceptions of nationhood, but an arm's length relationship to the nation, low levels of national pride, is goes in the other direction, right? It's associated with Trump support. So it's not just ethnic versus civic, right? It's also that some quote unquote civic nationalists who are particularly unproud of the nation, who are disengaged from the nation, went for Trump over Clinton, which I think is quite interesting. Trump versus moderates, similar pattern, although the disengaged doesn't become as salient here. Creedal nationalists went for moderates over Trump, and vice versa. Others went for Trump over Clinton. Trump versus Cruz, no significant differences, partly because they're similar candidates, but also the sample size is quite small here, so we don't want to say too much about it. Interestingly, Clinton versus Sanders, this is within Democratic primaries, right? This is within party competition. Those who have an arm's length relationship to the nation, that is, they're inclusive in terms of national boundaries, but have low levels of pride and low levels of chauvinism, were consistently more likely to vote for Sanders over Clinton. This means, on the flip side, that people who had ethno-nationalist conceptions of America voted for Clinton over Sanders, right? So again, it's not just ethnic versus civic, it's also about levels of pride and chauvinism. It's about these configurations of nationhood altogether, which I think is pretty interesting. Okay, what happened over time? Well, we're looking between 1996 and 2016 with multiple data points. This is the aggregate. A little messy, but no clear secular change. You've got this big juncture after 9/11, which I showed in the previous paper, where exclusionary nationalism goes up, but then goes back to baseline. It's largely oscillation around a common mean to a large extent. But look what happens when you separate it by party. This is the Democrats. What happens over time is that back in 1996, as I showed in the previous paper, you could not predict somebody's partisan identity based on their nationalist beliefs, and vice versa. You couldn't predict their nationalism based on their party ID. Democrats and Republicans were both heterogeneous in terms of the conceptions of nationhood back in 1996. In fact, restrictive and creedal nationalism were both equally prevalent among Democrats. By 2016, look what happens to creedal nationalism. It goes through the roof among Democrats, and restrictive nationalism becomes almost extinct among Democrats. Let me zoom in on the two that changed the most. Okay, other than the post 9/11 period, which was a very unsettled period in the United States, you've got basically a drop in restrictives and a surge in creedals among Democrats. Now, among Republicans, it's the opposite. Among Republicans, I'm just going to focus on the ones that change, you've got, again, actually come back to this. Back in 96, creedal nationalism, inclusive, proud, chauvinistic nationalism, but inclusive, was the most dominant form of nationalism among Republicans. By 2016, it's around 20%. And restrictive nationalism, the unproud, moderately chauvinistic, exclusionary nationalism accounts for 50% of Republican voters. That's a huge change over a matter of 20 years. And you can do the same thing for strong Democrats, strong Republicans. I'll skip that. Here's a summary. The probability of being Republican, given your nationalist beliefs over time, creedal, disengaged, restrictive, and ardent. creedal nationalists, the probability that you're Republican if you subscribe to creedal nationalist beliefs just plummets over time. The probability that you're a Republican given restrictive nationalist beliefs increases sharply over time. Again, whatever one thinks about these latent classes, they have tremendous external validity. This would be impossible with classes that were noisy and or that were artifactual. Okay, but more importantly, what you see is that the two parties in the United States, their supporters no longer agree about what America means. You can imagine how hard it is to do politics when you don't agree at all about what the country means to you and where it should head. And you can also imagine why all of a sudden nationalist claims become the most salient claims in a given election, where we saw the associations that we did between nationalist beliefs and voting preferences. So this is the end. The idea is that nationalist contributors were central to 2016, both primary and general. You saw the findings, so I won't go over them again. That in the aggregate, nationalism is not becoming more exclusionary, but there's a lot of evidence of partisan sorting, catalyzed maybe by 9/11, maybe peaking in 2012. But what it shows is growing Republican demand for Trump-like politics for now many years. Trump didn't start this, right? This is why we had the Tea Party. This is why we had Sarah Palin and eventually Trump. What Trump did is he took the strand and crafted this just the right discursive bundle in just the right structural moment to capitalize on this long growing trend of Republican radicalism. Now, the implication for US politics, I'm going to skip because we're out of time. I can tell you what I think was going to happen, maybe what's happened or what is happening to liberal democracy in the United States. I'll come back to it if you want. But I just want to say that, I mentioned that we need multicausal explanations and we need sensitivity to case specificity and overarching trends. But I've been talking mostly about the US. Well, you can imagine other countries work slightly differently, right? And so I am happy to discuss how I think this works elsewhere. Obviously, the leading causes, the structural shifts are different. Obviously, the content of the claims is different, right? In Poland, you've got Islamophobia without Muslims, anti-Semitism without Jews, and a dominance of anti-LGBTQ and anti-feminist discourse. That's very different than the United States, and so forth. We can talk about all the cases. But the mechanisms of collective status threat mobilized by populist, nationalist, and authoritarian claims, in particular conditions of structural cultural change, are, in my view, quite consistent across all of these cases. So the takeaway is, I think to understand radical right politics, we must take populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism seriously, not just as sort of sources of definitional problems that we, bicker over, but really as analytically meaningful categories in their own right that we can theorize, we can measure. And then I think we really need to place nationalism at the center of our explanations, as many people at ASEN do. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Oops, can I? Thank you very much, Professor Bonikowski, for this absolutely stimulating display of models of high-level model construction. And we have some interesting questions that our audience have been asking. And I'm going to ask you the first question that I saw, which is from Fatih Burmesh, who is asking about the link between radicalism on the one hand, and on the other, neoconservatives or extreme Christians. We shall take one question at a time, I think.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, so this is a great question because it really brings together the complex or highlights the complexity of the right. And certainly, given the question about conservative Christians, let me talk about the US for a second. So there's this question of where does mainstream end and radicalism begin? What's the relationship between the extreme far right, that is organized white supremacist movements, for instance, and the increasingly radicalized Republican Party? Where do evangelical Christians fit in? There are books written about this, and I have to talk for a long time to really get to the answer. But the bottom line is that for a long time, the Republican Party has been flirting with radicalism, right? Through dog whistle politics of various sorts. It's brought in and emphasized on the importance of evangelical Christianity in its ranks for a long time, but especially since the 80s and really ramped up in the 90s. And in so doing, has flirted with Christian nationalism. The idea that not just that Christianity is important or Christians' beliefs should be respected, but that Christianity is an essential element of what it means to be American. Okay, that they've doubled down on that repeatedly to get votes. And so quite often, and I've got a paper forthcoming on this, or I'm working a paper on this, is that a lot of mainstream politicians play around with frames that are exclusionary, that are, that are populist or whatnot, they're authoritarian, and they think they're doing so just to gain votes strategically, but they're actually playing with fire because they normalize those frames and make those frames available to others. And then somebody like Trump comes along, or somebody like Le Pen comes along, you can imagine examples, who pick these frames and make something of them that is more than just fear mongering for votes, but is actually a construction of a radical view of what the nation is and where the nation should head. In so doing, these radical politicians who either become, either new radical parties as in European multi-party systems, or the capturing of mainstream parties by radical candidates as in the US, they then play with another fire, if you will, and that is the fire of the alt-right, of white supremacy. They are not inherently always white supremacists themselves, but they certainly like the attention from white supremacists, and they like the legitimacy they get from them because they're reaching out to the radical factions of the electorate. And so in the United States, when Trump gets endorsed by David Duke, a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, he does not disavow that. When the attacks in Charlottesville happen, he says, "Hey, good people on both sides." He's doing that, or he was doing that, in order, again, to show the more radical white supremacist supporters among the electorate that he's on their side, right? Obviously. And so I think the point here is, we know from Daniel Ziblatt's work that if the center right doesn't put its foot down and oppose the radical right, that is, and they do the opposite, if they move in the direction of the radical right to gain their support of their voters, democracy is in trouble. And that's basically what has happened in the Republican Party. It's what's happened in center right parties around Europe. And that's why the book I'm working on is called Radicalized, because it's really about the radicalization of the voters through the kind of patterns I just showed you, and the radicalization of the parties, specifically center right parties, and some newcomers, in the pursuit of those radicalized voters. And in the pursuit of the emboldening of those voters. So essentially what you have is kind of unholy kind of unity of center right, radical right, elements of the far right, and elements of Christian or religious nationalism. And of course, again, if you go beyond Europe and the United States, if you go to India, for example, in the pursuit Hindu nationalism becomes a really important component of the equation in very similar ways. So hopefully that at least was a hint at an answer, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Yes, thank you. And can I just follow up on this with a small question? How do Black Christians relate to the Republican, to this link between conservatives and so on, and as compared with the Malcolm X, the Black movement, the Islamic Black Christians?
Right. So that's a really interesting question, because actually in the 2016 paper we published, we had this finding that we try to do everything in our power to make sure it was right, because it was a little controversial. But the finding was that actually restrictive nationalism, this kind of exclusionary, low pride nationalism, was overrepresented among whites for sure, but also overrepresented among African Americans. So there was actually some commonality here around exclusion. And the way we sort of interpreted that was that it makes some sense, actually, if you think about it. That is, the status of African Americans in the United States is about ancestry, right? The idea that we've been here since the beginning, right? Our membership in the nation is about ancestry. It's about birth. It's about shared cultures. It's about Christianity, and that, in some ways, there may lead to some tensions with immigration, right? For some conservative African Americans, but at the same time, just because that way of thinking is overrepresented among African Americans doesn't mean that it's the same as the kind of restrictive nationalism of the white nationalists. And because of the politics of the two parties, obviously, most African Americans vote predominantly for the Democratic Party. In 2020, there were 12 or 13% of African Americans and higher among men than women who voted for Trump the second time around, and presumably partly for these reasons. Partly because maybe labor market competition with immigrants, partly because of these nationalist beliefs I mentioned, but this is a small minority. For most part, and also some small portion of Latinos voted for Trump as well. So it's, that's something worth thinking about, especially Cubans in Miami, Tejanos in Southern Texas. But despite that, for most part, radical politics in the United States and elsewhere is the politics of the majority, in this case, the white Christian majority or the white majority. So, the other kind of, the fact that there are some minority groups who also favor this form of politics in very small proportions is interesting and worth digging into, but it doesn't certainly explain the whole thing. Anyway, happy to talk about that more.
Thank you very much. We have another interesting question by Matvey Lomonosov, who is asking if I may use Bart's broader excellent expertise In view of your and other recent research, is there still any sense in distinguishing nationalism and patriotism? Nationalism studies scholars have been skeptical of this, while psychologists somewhat enthusiastic in the
Yeah,
distinction between nationalism and patriotism.
great question, and I have thoughts. But look, it's on some level it doesn't matter, right? As long as we know what we're measuring or what we're asking in interviews, or what, as long as we're clear about our definitions and as long as we're clear about our empirical strategies, we can probably sift through terminological disagreements when reading each other's work and build on it. In my own work, on the other hand, I have not used the word patriotism because the whole conception of the logic of my work is that patriotism is a normatively loaded term that assumes that my nationalism is just patriotism and your nationalism is the real nationalism, right? And when I say my and yours, I'm obviously being facetious, but Michael Billig has written about this, right? It's an important quote from his book where nationalism is always other people's problems. It's a problem. It's a problem of people elsewhere in the world or people elsewhere in history, but it's not something that I have to worry about. So for me, patriotism is a label that's okay for one type of nationalism, a nationalism that's, maybe high in national pride, although it's not clear what it says about national boundaries. It's not clear what it says about chauvinism. So it's a label for that set of variables, for national pride variables that people often use. I just think it's problematic because as soon as political scientists start talking about patriotism, they say, well, actually, wait a minute, some of this stuff is not so great. So let's divide it further into constructive patriotism and blind patriotism. Okay, well, now we're kind of undoing the whole point of using that term, which was supposed to be the good nationalism. So just to me, it's just not worth the terminological hassle. For me, the way I think about nationalism is as a broad domain, right, of conceptual, of thinking, of believing, of affect, of collective narratives, which is, I think, how ASEN thinks about it, right? Like, if you think about the fact that nationalism is in the title of this organization, that nationalism is in the title of Nations and Nationalism as a journal. Presumably, we're not just talking about nationalism as political psychologists talk about, which is just chauvinism and nothing else, right? We're talking about all of this stuff. We're talking about nation-state formation and nation formation. We talk about invented traditions. We're talking about that whole historical trajectory, but we're also talking about, once we've invented those traditions, about how we differ in which traditions we think are salient and what the nation means to us. And so, to me, these kind of terminological bickerings are kind of fun and interesting, but at the end of the day, I think use whatever term you think makes sense for your research, but I think we should be clear about our definitions. So for me, I don't use patriotism because I just don't find it analytically clear enough and analytically advantageous enough to be useful in my work. So if I were to sort of advocate, I would advocate for the use of nationalism, but then subcategorizing into various dimensions as people have done in the past. But that's just my take.
Thank you very much. Now there's a question from Rachel, who is asking, is there any way to combine latent class analysis with fuzzy sets?
Yeah, so there are methods that are not discrete, right? Where you can have partial membership in clusters. There are all kinds of clustering methods that allow you to do that. And in fact, even within latent class analysis, you do get continuous probabilities of class assignment. So each respondent will, let's say you end up with 4 classes like we did, each respondent will have a probability of membership in each one of those 4 classes. And so that's a continuous probability, which then gets turned into a discrete allocation to one class or another. So you could play with that a little bit, but typically these in a decent model, and in our models this is the case, the membership probability is extremely skewed. So one class people have like 95% membership in class 1, and then like 2%, 1% in the others. If it were not that crisp and clear, then you would see that the model is not very good classifying people into classes. So yes, there are all kinds of more fuzzy set-based methods, and I think those are tremendously interesting. And in fact, I've always thought about, or sort of struggled with thinking about whether membership in these classes and these groups, I don't want to essentialize them. These are not real things, by the way, right? These are simplifications of a complex reality. These are heuristics. And I think there's a danger in assuming that these things are actual things out there in the world. As I said, there are hundreds, thousands of types of nationalism in the population, but they can be reduced to this smaller set. Okay, but the question is, how stable are these things within individuals, right? And is there so we've seen the sorting of nationalism by party. Does that mean that people have switched parties based on their nationalist beliefs, or have they changed their nationalist beliefs in response to party cues? That's a really important question to which we don't have an answer, because you need longitudinal data. And most people are not interested enough in nationalism to measure it longitudinally at scale for a long period of time. Something I'm hoping to change a little bit. I've got some now repeated interviews, and I can maybe start getting at this question, but it's a complicated one. And it's complicated by virtue of two things. Sorry, I'm kind of going on a tangent from your question, Rachel, but I think it's interesting. That is, we know partisan identification is very powerful and sticky over the life course. On the other hand, what you think the nation means should probably be a pretty deep sense as well. And so there is some work, for example, by Michael Tesler in his book, Post-Racial or Most Racial, where he shows that actually over time in the last couple of decades, racial resentment has been predictive of party switching. And if racial resentment has been predictive of it, presumably nationalist beliefs have also been predictive of it. But quite likely it goes in the other direction too. And if it does go in the other direction too, from party ID to nationalism, then the question becomes the question I would like to answer, but I don't have an answer to. Are the pathways between these different types of nationalism equally likely, right? So are you just as likely to go from disengaged nationalism to restrictive nationalism, or from disengaged to ardent? And I just don't know. But with longitudinal data, we should be able to get some purchase on that. So that's not exactly about fuzzy sets, it's about movement between discrete categories. But I think fuzzy sets could also help you get at that, because maybe people who are in between categories are more likely to change their minds. Maybe they're more likely to respond to partisan cues. Maybe they're more likely to have highly oscillating salience of nationalist beliefs in their political behavior. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question. So I would encourage you to pursue that line of research.
Another question, we have two more questions, including this one from Dmitry. You looked at the temporal variation of the disengaged, ardent, creedal, and restrictive. Is there any geographic variation over time?
That's a great question. So there is a ton of geographic variation, period. And I wrote a dissertation that was comparative across a lot of countries long time ago. It's a working paper. I never published it because I keep wanting to tweak it, because it's really hard. It's hard enough to do this in one country at a time. Now, and then you have issues of model fit and all kinds of other issues. Now imagine doing this across 30 countries. Now you've got 30,000 people, 23 variables. There's just a lot of complexity. I've done a little bit of this with Christina Simonsen in the paper we published last year on civic nationalism across countries as a predictor of anti-Muslim attitudes. And there we did latent class analysis that allowed the categories to vary in their content and prevalence across countries. So it's kind of multi-level LCA model. It gets pretty tricky. But if you impose homogeneity on the content of the classes, that is, you say, okay, the same classes are going to be found in all the countries. So you can make that assumption in the model, which is a strong assumption, but allows you at least to compare. Then what you will see is a lot of variation in their prevalence across countries. So in Eastern Europe, there's a lot more restrictive nationalism and disengagement than there is in Western Europe. In Western Europe, there's a lot less ardent nationalism, that is this kind of exclusionary, high pride, chauvinistic nationalism, than in the United States or in Eastern Europe, for that matter, from what I remember. So there are patterns that you would kind of expect based on the histories of the places and the histories of their political discourse. But nonetheless, all four classes will be present in other countries, and I'm working on the paper to show whether they're related to radical right politics or not. I do have a chapter in a book that shows that in France and Germany, if you do the analysis separately in those two countries, you will see similar types of nationalism come out of the model, and similar patterns of relationship with radical right voting and anti-immigrant attitudes, at least in those two countries. There's also an ASR paper coming out by Thomas Sowell and co-authors. It's coming out later this year, that answers your question directly, and that is, well, almost it does. It looks at the degree to which current distributions of these nationalist types across countries are partly a result of those countries' experiences with losses of sovereignty and having been occupied by other countries, having had crises of nationhood, essentially. So I think that's an interesting pathway as well. But then your question really gets at, like, well, okay, now if we can identify the same classes across different places, what do we see temporally? Do we see the same kind of sorting that I described? And that question is still unanswered, although I'm really interested in answering it, because it's part of my model, theoretical model. I just don't have the empirics for it, right? The question is, but it's difficult because there are no two-party systems where you can neatly just see sorting between two parties, right? So in a multi-party system, the question then becomes, is nationalism sorting by party? Is nationalism sorting by party family, right? Is it sort of socialist, center left, center right, radical right? Is that the axis of sorting? Is it sorting between new and old parties? That's a different axis of variation, right? And so that paper I would like to write, and it's like another paper that's somewhere down my list of the future, in the near future, is to look at all those axes of variation and see, are nationalist beliefs sorting across some of these more than others? And I guess I don't have strong hypotheses about which one it would be, but I do think that whatever classification scheme you use, the radical right would most likely become more restrictive and or ardent nationalists, most likely. But it gets complicated because by the fact that civic nationalism has also been weaponized by the radical right in Western and Northern Europe. So it's just, the sorting question is much easier when you've got two parties and very clear kind of ways of operationalizing things. So anyway, another interesting question and potential future research direction for anyone.
Thank you, Bart. I have probably looks like a final question from David. Are there people who do not fall into any of the four classes?
Right. So that comes back to the fuzzy set question. There may be some, but when we look at the probabilities of class assignment, they're pretty uniformly high. That is, they're around between high 80%, like 0.85 to 0.98 kind of probability of assignment. So the algorithm is, or the method is pretty good at being able to sort people into categories. Although there may be, who knows, there may be some who are kind of fall in the 80% range. Let's say maybe they're a little bit on the outside. So that in a fuzzy set kind of perspective, they'll be far from the centroid. They'll be around the peripheries of the classes. And then, as I mentioned, that may have certain implications for their politics. So yeah, it's a great question that could be explored using different methods, or maybe by exploring or looking at the classification probabilities within this method. I know that there were other questions in the chat, and I appreciate them. They're wonderful. Martin Luke, hi Martin, had a question about the two-party system versus multi-party systems, where I kind of got to some of that in my previous answer. And of course, it's about party capture versus the emergence of new parties, or electoral threshold differences. There are all kinds of interesting differences there. And differences in terms of implications for liberal democracy vary quite a bit as well. And then I guess we should probably wrap up. Athena, the last question, I don't know, I haven't actually read it yet.
Actually, we could take a few more questions if you
oh,
are
sure.
happy.
Yeah, happy to do so.
Good. There's a question here from Sam Pryke. Yeah, just wondering how, if at all, it is possible through quantitative survey data to factor in ideological context in accounting for the shifts you observe. A lot of people, liberal Americans in my experience, would possibly simplistically account for the change you find from credo to restrictive nationalism amongst Republicans through a particular media source, Fox News.
Okay, that's great. That was that one, and then we had and then I think Jonathan Hearn had a question about democracy.
And Jonathan.
Oh, yes. Daphne too.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll answer, Sam. I'll answer your question relatively quickly. I think that's a simplistic narrative, as I think you alluded to in your question. People say, "Oh, it's all social media," or "It's all Fox News," right? It actually turns out to be really hard to find strong media effects and social media effects in terms of the radicalization of politics. There have been some studies who've done a decent job. Like there's a study that looks at the kind of semi-randomized rollout of Fox News and use that as experimentally as a natural experiment to see if that led to more conservative partisan choices. And it did to some degree, but how strong that effect is not clear. We've had a lot of talk about social media bubbles and echo chambers and so forth. And it turns out a lot of that research the claims are overblown. There is some of that happening, but it's really hard to nail down exactly what it's doing at the individual level. I think it's more interesting to see what it's doing at the aggregate level, right? So maybe it's not radicalizing individuals, because individuals, for most part, don't care about politics, to be honest, and many of them have pretty diverse media diets, if at all. But it does lead to the kind of broad weakening of beliefs in epistemic authority. It sort of unsettles what expertise, and it kind of makes democracy harder to do in that respect. Is that anything goes, and people don't really know who to believe. But the straight line from Fox News to Trump, I think, is a little bit overblown. Although it's quite attractive to think that way because Fox News is so sensationalist. There was a question about, I don't know, Athena, if I have time for this, but there was a question about democracy. And so I think I'll just very quickly say that, you kind of know the answer to this already. And that is that US democracy has been weakened for sure through the violation of norms, through various forms of clientelism and corruption. What some call discriminatory legalism is focusing on specific groups using the letter of the law.
I can't see you well, Bart.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Did you not? Oh, you couldn't hear me?
Yeah, a bit better now.
Okay, sorry. Right. So there are all these things that people have written about. Kurt Weiland has written about. Levitsky and Ziblatt have written about. That is, that there's been damage done to the institutions, of course. But in some ways, the one saving grace in the United States, at least, has been the incompetence of Trump. And that is that he wasn't a particularly effective president. But others may come along who'll be more effective. There are people waiting in the sidelines already. And the Republican Party will face a choice of whether to double down on its ethno-nationalist kind of exclusionary rhetoric and its populism or not. And I'm not too optimistic given the party's past attempts at soul searching that didn't go anywhere. I did mention that it's not just about nationalism, it's not just about electoral politics and institutions. It's also about interpersonal relations, and that is, once you open the can of worms of nationalist politics, it has implications for how people deal with one another on the streets. And so, right after the 2016 election, we saw all kinds of violence against African Americans, against immigrants. We're now seeing an awful wave of violence against Asian Americans as a result of Trump's talk about COVID. In fact, a friend of the family just this morning was pushed onto the tracks of a New York City subway. She's Asian American. This stuff is happening every day. So these are consequences that are not just about institutions. They're also about what people think is they're allowed to say and how they're allowed to act in public. So, I think the implications are far-reaching for both the liberal side of liberal democracy and the democratic side of liberal democracy. We know what's happened in Hungary and Poland. Kim Shepley has written about this a lot, and of course, again, Ziblatt and Levitsky and Ziblatt have warned us about it in the U.S. So I think the question is what to do going forward, and I think the onus is in some ways on Democrats. This is something Sherry Berman would probably argue, to find a better way of appealing to voters. And I think it's about meaningful policy, but it's also about changing the topic of the conversation. It's about changing the salience of nationalism, of dropping the salience of nationalism and replacing with other things that actually matter more. And I think Obama tried to do this, and he in some ways was particularly well equipped to do so, of being the president of all Americans. But it's hard to do that without forsaking the interest of minority groups, right? It's sort of like it's a balance between an inclusive nationalism while also trying to do something about the terrible injustices and inequalities in society, right? And so Biden has been quite successful so far, I think, in walking that line, but it's a hard line to walk. My concern is, though, that that Republicans are not going to change their tack, and we're going to see the same kind of politics come back in 4 years, or maybe in 2 years in the congressional election in the U.S. And of course, in Europe, we're already seeing the center right mimicking the radical right in quite powerful ways across many countries. So I think that at least in the United States, the next steps are to fix the electoral institutions, which are under severe strain. And to maybe reclaim some of the role of the country in sort of global leadership to mitigate the threats of this kind of politics. So, you know a lot about this already, all of you, but I think, we're not quite out of the woods in the US by any means. I think what we have is an intermission, frankly. And how bad the next chapter will be, the next act will be, depends on what Democrats, to some degree, but what we all do during that intermission, whether we shore up the institutions and offer an alternative to this virulent type of politics.
Thank you very much, Bart. There is a question from Daphne. Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. I am thinking of the counterfactual. How would a non-nationalist route to radical right voting fit in your model? For example, through a pure protest mechanism?
So let me see if I get this question correctly, Daphne. So I guess the one way I was thinking about it, so is the question, if we didn't place nationalism at the center, how else could we explain the rise of radical politics? Is that, am I getting that roughly right? I guess Daphne can't respond to me directly, but assuming that that's right, I mean, plenty of people do that, right? So if you think about the entire economics versus culture debate, which I think is ill conceived because it's not either or, it's both and they interact with one another. But let's say that one, right? Like the economists out there who are doing work on this, except for some who are more heterodox, will say what's just about, it's simply about the economy and people's response to China trade shocks. All the nationalism stuff, that's just epiphenomenal. That's not even anything worth worrying about. So the real problem is, you know, the moving of jobs elsewhere, and the solution is to build more protection into trade agreements. Okay. Others will say it's actually all about populism. Like if you read Hochschild or Kramer, they're great books, and actually there are plenty of hints of nationalism in there. But really, it's about class resentment and rural versus urban resentment, right? And I totally buy that argument. I just think it's part and parcel of a broader model where nationalism comes to fill in the kind of voids that this populism creates. But you know, that explanation is more about rural America has been forsaken, or just in Guest's work, you know, rural England, small town England, rural England has been forsaken by the elites. As a result, they're getting fewer resources, they're getting less representation. And that's the crux of the problem. It's really just about populism at the center. And the nationalism stuff, you know, that's just epiphenomenal again. So I think the point is that you can, you know, or let's do the last one. Okay, just last, authoritarianism, right? So it's all about how your child rearing views, and your child rearing views become more salient under certain circumstances. So it's really about authoritarian personalities. All of these are plausible, and all of them emphasize different pieces of this puzzle in different ways. And my sense has been that nationalism has been largely this thing thrown to the side. Like it's obviously there, but it's not the driver. It's not the main thing that people are voting with. It's kind of, again, kind of this epiphenomenal consequence of this other stuff. And I think my attempt is to not say this is the single explanation, but rather to say we need to piece together an explanation that thinks about how to interact these different pieces of the model, right? So it's not that populism doesn't matter, or that, you know, that Wisconsin rural identity doesn't matter, or right? It's just that it's not entirely sufficient. It interacts with other cultural phenomena under certain circumstances, and that's what makes it work. Now, the last thing I'll say is, could you falsify the model? Like, what is the actual counterfactual? Sure, right? Like, if it turns out that there are places where radical politics succeeds without stoking any nationalist sentiments, without making any nationalist claims in the rhetoric, then obviously nationalism is not a relevant category in that case. And you know, there are Philippines could be, maybe, you know, people have argued that really populism is more important in the Philippines than nationalism is. And I'm open to that suggestion, although there are plenty of conflicts around southern, terrorism from Muslims in the South, and anti-communist rhetoric, and all kinds of anti-imperialist rhetoric. But, you know, I'm open to the possibility that in some cases, some of these elements matter more than others. Absolutely. So I think it's really about just empirical investigation, but I'm always happy to talk more about it, Daphne.
Thank you very much, Bart.
Sure.
That's an excellent answer to Daphne's question. Thank you for answering all the questions. I hope I hadn't seen the other questions that appeared after David's, but you did, and thank you for pointing them out to me. So thank you. We need to close now, and thank you very much, Bart, for the excellent paper. Everyone who wrote in the chat box was delighted and grateful for your clear and precise presentation, and a very clear answer to the questions and serious consideration of the questions. Our next event is at 16:30 Coordinated Universal Time, CUT. And following that, it's a panel session. It's panel session F. And following that, at 1600 CUT, we are going to have our grand finale, which is going to be a roundtable discussion on regional perspectives on crisis with Lenka Bustikova, Judith Byfield, Dan Slater, and Miguel Centeno. And that session will close the conference with some brief closing remarks from our president, Professor Jonathan Hearn. I hope very much that Bart will stay with us and enjoy and join in the discussion after the roundtable presentations. Thank you all very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Great to see you. Thank you.
Session. Bye-bye.